The Wyoming wilderness stretched out endlessly, a patchwork of jagged hills, sprawling meadows, and dense pine forests. Spring had thawed the snow, leaving behind damp earth and the soft hum of life returning to the land. Sylvester Cage adjusted the strap on his rifle as he trudged through the undergrowth, flanked by his two longtime friends, Mark and Daniel. The air smelled of pine and wet soil, a far cry from the smog-laden streets of Los Angeles. Here, the world felt raw and untamed. The trio had been hunting together for years, their trips an annual tradition born out of shared passion and the need to escape their busy lives. For Sylvester, these outings were a reprieve from the suffocating pace of the city, where every day felt like a battle against time and ambition. He thought about his father, who had introduced him to hunting their family vacations in the Sierra Nevada mountains. His father's patience and skill with a bow were legendary, traits Sylvester admired but struggled to emulate. This year's trip had brought them to the heart of Wyoming's wilderness, an area known for its game-rich forests and breathtaking vistas. It was sunny, the light filtering through the canopy in golden streaks, but the warmth did little to dispel the chill that lingered in the shadows. By the second evening, they had set up camp in a clearing near a small creek. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the fading light as they recounted stories of past hunts. Sylvester leaned back against his pack, letting the conversation wash over him. His thoughts drifted to the stories he'd read online about the region, tales of strange occurrences and whispered legends of skinwalkers. He dismissed them as folklore, the kind of campfire stories meant to thrill and terrify. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest, a sudden stillness settled over the camp. The usual chorus of crickets and distant rustlings ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. Sylvester's hand instinctively went to his rifle as he scanned the tree line. That's when he saw it. A figure crouched behind a tree at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the dim light. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its posture unnatural. The eyes caught the firelight, reflecting a faint, malevolent glow. Sylvester froze, his breath hitching as the creature tilted its head as if studying him. "Do you see that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Mark and Daniel followed his gaze, their expressions shifting from confusion to alarm. The figure didn't move, its unblinking stare fixed on them. Sylvester's mind raced. It could be a person, someone lost or playing a prank, but something about it felt off. Predatory. Primal. Without warning, the creature vanished into the darkness, moving so quickly it seemed to blur. The trio sat in stunned silence, the weight of what they'd just witnessed pressing down on them. "We're leaving," Sylvester said, his voice firm, at first light. They kept the fire burning high that night, taking turns standing watch. Sylvester sat with his back to the flames, his rifle across his lap, listening to the forest. The occasional snap of a branch or rustle of leaves set his nerves on edge, but the creature didn't return. By morning, the sunny sky belied the tension that hung over them. They packed their gear in record time and started the trek back to their truck, sticking close together as they navigated the uneven terrain. The woods, once vibrant and inviting, now felt oppressive, every shadow a potential hiding place. Halfway through their journey, the creature struck. It came out of nowhere, a blur of motion and guttural growls. Daniel screamed as the thing knocked him to the ground, its claws raking across his arm. Sylvester fired his rifle, the sound deafening in the confined space. The creature recoiled, its cry a bone-chilling mix of pain and rage. "Run!" Sylvester shouted, grabbing Mark by the arm. They ran, adrenaline pushing them forward as the forest seemed to close in around them. The creature gave chase, its inhuman cries echoing through the trees. They stumbled onto a narrow game trail, the packed dirt offering a mercifully clear path. Daniel lagged behind, clutching his bleeding arm. Sylvester turned and fired again, the shot grazing the creature and buying them precious seconds. They burst out of the forest onto the main road, lungs burning and legs trembling. A pickup truck approached, the driver slamming on the brakes as they waved frantically. The driver, a wiry old man with a look of bewildered concern, helped them into the truck. "What the hell happened to you boys?" he asked, eyeing Daniel's injury. "Animal attack," Sylvester said quickly, unwilling to elaborate. The ride to the nearest town was silent, the trio too shaken to speak. They dropped Daniel at the local clinic before heading to a diner to regroup. Over cups of scalding coffee, they debated whether to report what had happened. In the end, they decided against it. Who would believe them? Sylvester stared out the diner window at the bustling street, the morning sun casting long shadows across the pavement. The events of the past night felt surreal, like a waking nightmare. But the scars on Daniel's arm and the fear etched into his friends' faces were proof enough. As they left the diner, Sylvester glanced at the distant tree line, a shiver running down his spine. He didn't know what they had encountered out there, but one thing was certain: the Wyoming wilderness held secrets he had no desire to uncover again. The thick canopy of autumn leaves stretched overhead, casting dappled light onto the winding main road. Chuck Winchester leaned forward in the driver's seat, peering through the windshield at the sudden flurry of snowflakes. It was unexpected for this time of year, but the weather here didn't follow the neat patterns of Los Angeles. The chill in the air and the sharp scent of pine were reminders that they were far from home. The car sputtered once, twice, and then died, coasting to a halt on the side of the road. Chuck cursed under his breath, gripping the wheel. In the back seat, his friends Gina and Paul exchanged uneasy glances. The last sign of civilization they'd passed had been miles ago, a dilapidated gas station with a faded closed for the season sign swinging in the breeze. "Great," Paul muttered. "Just great. Middle of nowhere, and now this." Chuck popped the hood, stepping out into the crisp air. The snow was falling steadily now, blanketing the trees and the road in white. He tried to shake the memory of his father fixing their old station wagon back when he was a kid. His dad's patience had been legendary, and Chuck could almost hear his voice guiding him through the repair. But as Chuck fiddled with the engine, it became clear this was beyond his skill. They decided to hike to find help, or at least shelter. The trio grabbed their packs and set off, following the narrow road that wound through the woods. The snow muffled their footsteps, and the silence was eerie, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. By late afternoon, they stumbled upon an old cabin, tucked back among the trees. It was weathered but intact, with a stone chimney that suggested it might still have a working fireplace. Reluctantly, they decided to stay the night. As darkness fell, they gathered around a fire Gina had managed to kindle in the hearth. The warmth was welcome, but the flickering shadows it cast on the walls did little to ease their nerves. Outside, the snow had turned the landscape into a silent, monochrome world. Chuck thought back to evenings with his younger brother, Dean, who had always been the braver one. Dean had a knack for making light of even the darkest situations. Chuck could almost hear him now, teasing him for getting stranded in the middle of nowhere. He missed that easy laughter, the way it could cut through tension like a knife. The first sign of trouble came with a sound, low, guttural, and inhuman. It carried through the still night, causing the fire to flicker as if the air itself trembled. Paul shot Chuck a look, his eyes wide. "Probably just a coyote," Gina whispered, though her voice wavered. But Chuck wasn't so sure. He moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. For a moment, he saw nothing but snow and trees. Then, just beyond the tree line, something moved. It was too large to be a coyote. Its silhouette was vaguely humanoid, but hunched, with long limbs and glowing eyes that reflected the firelight like embers. "Guys," Chuck said, backing away from the window. "We're not alone." The creature moved fast, faster than anything should. One moment it was at the edge of the forest. The next, it was circling the cabin, its guttural growls vibrating in their chests. The three of them huddled by the fire, their breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. Gina clutched a heavy iron poker, her knuckles white. Paul had a hunting knife, though his hands shook as he gripped it. Chuck searched the room, his heart pounding. They needed a plan, but panic was setting in, making it hard to think. For hours, the creature circled the cabin, its movements barely visible through the small, frosted windows. It seemed to be testing them, waiting for a moment of weakness. They could hear it scraping against the wooden walls, its claws carving shallow grooves into the boards. At some point during the night, the sounds stopped. The silence was almost worse, every creak of the cabin amplified by their fear. None of them slept. As dawn broke, they made their move. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but its tracks crisscrossed the snow outside, deep and clawed. They set out on foot, heading back toward the car. The woods felt alive with unseen eyes, every shadow a potential hiding place. Then it came again. This time it attacked with savage force, lunging at them from behind a cluster of trees. Paul screamed as the creature's claws raked across his arm, sending him sprawling into the snow. Chuck fired the flare gun he'd found in the cabin, the brilliant light startling the creature long enough for them to drag Paul to his feet. They ran, the creature in pursuit, its guttural growls echoing through the trees. Gina tripped, her pack spilling onto the ground. Chuck turned back, pulling her to her feet as the creature closed in. He fired the flare gun again, the second shot sending it skittering back into the shadows. When they finally reached the car, their hands were numb and trembling as they fumbled with the keys. The engine sputtered to life, and Chuck floored the gas, the tires spinning in the snow before finding traction. As they sped down the road, the creature emerged from the trees one last time, its glowing eyes watching them until they disappeared from view. They drove without stopping until they reached the nearest town, a sleepy hamlet with a diner and a gas station. Paul's arm was bandaged, his face pale and drawn. They debated going to the police, but decided against it. What could they say? That they'd been hunted by something out of a nightmare? Chuck sat in the diner, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He stared out the window at the snowy street, his mind replaying the events of the past 2 days. He didn't know what they had encountered in those woods, but one thing was certain. Maine's wilderness held secrets he never wanted to uncover again. The dense Wisconsin forest was silent, save for the crunch of snow underfoot and the distant sound of water lapping against the icy banks of the river. John Johnson tugged his parka tighter, the cold biting through even the thickest layers. He had grown up in Wichita, where the winters were harsh, but nothing like this. The air here felt different, heavier, quieter, as if the snow itself muffled sound. John and his two friends, Mark and Eddie, had driven up for a winter fishing trip, hoping to take advantage of the solitude and untouched beauty of the area. They had chosen this remote spot, miles from the nearest town, to escape the bustle of their lives. For John, it was a rare break from the hum of aircraft engines back home. His job as a mechanic at a small regional airport kept him busy, his days marked by the smell of jet fuel and the clanging of metal. The first night passed uneventfully. They set up camp near the frozen river, their tents pitched in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The fire crackled warmly as they traded stories, their breath misting in the freezing air. John thought of his sister, who had teased him about taking a vacation in the dead of winter. "You could have gone to the Gulf or something," she'd said, rolling her eyes. But for John, there was something soothing about the stark stillness of this place. By the second day, the weather had turned. A steady drizzle began mid-morning, the rain freezing into a slick glaze on every surface. The fishing was poor, the river reluctant to give up its secrets. Eddie, always the optimist, joked that they should have brought a deck of cards instead of fishing rods. Mark, who had been unusually quiet, kept glancing at the woods. "Something feels off," he muttered as they packed up their gear to head back to camp. "I don't know, man. Like we're being watched." John laughed it off, though he couldn't shake the feeling either. The shadows among the trees seemed to shift when he wasn't looking, and the quiet of the forest felt too complete, too deliberate. That night, as the rain tapered off, They sat around the fire, trying to ignore the oppressive darkness that pressed in on all sides. Mark was sharpening his knife, the rhythmic scrape grating against John's nerves. Eddie was staring into the flames, uncharacteristically subdued. The first sign of trouble came as a sound, a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate through the air. John froze, his hand tightening around his mug of coffee. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was joined by a rustling in the underbrush. Something was moving out there, circling their camp. Mark stood, his knife at the ready. "Stay close to the fire," he said, his voice low. The creature emerged from the shadows just at the edge of the firelight. It was unlike anything John had ever seen. Its shape was vaguely humanoid, but wrong. Too long, too angular, with limbs that bent in unnatural ways. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight like mirrors. It didn't move closer, just prowled around the perimeter, its movements fluid and deliberate. Eddie was the first to panic, grabbing a log from the fire and hurling it at the creature. The burning wood fell short, and the thing reacted with a guttural hiss, retreating momentarily into the darkness. Then it lunged. Chaos erupted. Mark slashed at it with his knife, landing a glancing blow that seemed to do little more than anger it. Eddie screamed as the creature's claws raked across his shoulder, sending him sprawling into the snow. John grabbed the hatchet from his pack, swinging wildly. The creature retreated again, melting back into the shadows. But they knew it wasn't gone. They dragged Eddie back to the fire and the scrape, the wound on his shoulder bleeding profusely. John tore strips from his shirt to bandage it, his hands shaking. The rain had started again, a cold, relentless drizzle that soaked through their clothes and extinguished what remained of the fire. They spent the night huddled together, backs to each other, weapons in hand. The creature didn't return, but they could hear it out there, pacing, its low hum reverberating through the forest. John's thoughts drifted to his mother, who had always told him he had too much curiosity for his own good. She would have scolded him for coming to a place like this, where the trees seemed to whisper secrets, and the dark was more than just an absence of light. By morning, the rain had turned to sleet, and Eddie's wound was starting to swell. They had no choice but to move. Packing quickly, they set off through the woods, following the faint outline of the trail that had brought them here. The creature stalked them the entire way. It stayed just out of sight, its movements marked by the occasional snap of a branch or the flash of those glowing eyes. They quickened their pace, slipping on the icy ground, their breath coming in gasps. Eddie was the first to fall. His strength gave out, and he collapsed in the snow, too weak to continue. John and Mark lifted him between them, their own muscles screaming with the effort. They pushed on, desperation driving them forward. When they finally reached the main road, it felt like a miracle. The asphalt was wet and slick, the rain still falling steadily, but the sight of a pickup truck approaching from the distance was the most beautiful thing John had ever seen. They flagged it down, and the driver, a gruff old man with a rifle in his back seat, helped them load Eddie into the cab. They didn't explain what had happened. What could they say? That they'd been hunted by something that defied explanation? They just asked to be taken to the nearest hospital, their voices hollow with exhaustion. As the truck pulled away, John glanced back at the forest. For a moment, he thought he saw movement among the trees, a flicker of something unnatural. Then it was gone, swallowed by the shadows. He turned away, his mind replaying the events of the past few days. Whatever they had encountered out there, it wasn't something he wanted to face again. Some mysteries, he thought, were better left unsolved.